in their local area, including, of course, the price competition, even though that's an advantage to customers. The other aspect of this new technology is you don't need a person on the end of the phone line keeping a manual ledger of bookings. Such and such a car is now being dispatched to a caterer present to pick somebody up. It's just all there automatically on the app. So sometimes there's discussion about whether there's actually a need for manual recording in a staffed office. So all of these changes have produced regulatory challenges. Regulators have had to find what is the correct regulatory response to this model, but also, to be fair, they've produced challenges for Uber as they've had to take their global model, which is operating in dozens of countries, and fit it in to this legislation, to the individualities of the UK regime. And they have to. It's perfectly proper that they do. That is the legislative regime, and they're going to have to fit in with it, and they recognise it. But Uber also recognises that it hasn't always done so perfectly. And it realises that it's got to work hard at developing and maintaining partnerships at a local level with local regulators according to local standards, which might be there in your handbook or in your policy. It's not good enough for Uber to say we're so big and brash and global that we don't need to listen to what you want locally. And Uber have recognised that, and it's one of the reasons that Fred Jones is here today and he's tried to engage with your officers. Now, Uber has a new global CEO. I told you he started this autumn. One of his first acts was to accept that Uber had not always got it right, and he unreservedly apologised, and he promised that Uber would work to make things right, and he ushered in a process of critical self-appraisal for Uber at global level and also at local level. And a key message of his, which I've said once, I won't say again after now, is that Uber has to work with humility and integrity. Those are the watchwords. As part of that, it has to be a partner to its local regulators. Where it has fallen out of step, this has to be corrected, and that is the drum to which Uber marches in the UK and specifically here in Cambridge. So when officers in their inspection find improvements are needed in Uber's processes to meet local expectations, Uber works immediately to comply. When officers propose reasonable conditions to go on the licence, we haven't asked, are these demanded and required or merely suggested or proposed? Uber have said, well, these look like a good idea, let's put them on the licence. So it doesn't just stand on its record in Cambridge, which is a good one, it wishes to be viewed here and elsewhere as a compliant and cooperative, albeit innovative, licensee. And it continues to learn. So that's really a little, I guess, a thumbnail sketch of Uber from the global to the local. And with that in mind, can I now just turn to some of the points made by the objectors in their various representations. And I'm going to start with page 45 of your bundle, which one or two objectors have relied upon, which deals with a decision made by Transport for London to refuse Uber London Limited a renewal of its licence, and that's now under appeal, and it's public knowledge that, of course, there are conversations being had with between Uber and TfL to see if some of these issues can be ironed out. Just looking at what was of concern to TfL, the first was its approach to reporting serious criminal offences. Now, obviously, we've just agreed on page 117 of your bundle that there will be an enhanced reporting requirement in Cambridge. So you're putting in a condition which meets this issue about reporting. I can tell you, and you've seen from the written submissions, that Uber employs former police officers who work closely with police. They collaborate over several areas, including routine investigations, serious crime and counter-terrorism. And you'll have picked up that Uber has established a law enforcement portal to enable the police quickly and securely to request trip data when it's investigating crime. And it's established a joint working group with the Metropolitan Police, meeting regularly with a view to the further improvement of Uber's processes and working relationship with the police. And of course, if there are local requirements in that regard, places like Cambridge, then of course Uber wishes to work properly with regulators here to ensure that the public are kept safe. The second point made by TfL related to medical certificates. And what happened here, I don't know whether you've come across a web-based GP service called Push Doctor, where you can actually meet your doctor online, see them face to face, and they can see you. Well, for a month, Uber allowed drivers to seek medical certificates through Push Doctor. This was, of course, cheaper and more convenient for drivers. They didn't need to take a day off and go to their GP. They could do it through Push Doctor. But after a month, TfL made clear it didn't want Uber to use that service. It wanted them to have a proper GP appointment and if a physical examination if necessary, and immediately Uber stopped doing that. So that is historic and it's not using Push Doctor. Thirdly, enhanced DBS checks. Now TfL, along with other operators, previously used and accepted DBS certificates from a variety of checkers, but then TfL said it would only accept them from one approved service. Of course Uber accepted this, but it did mean that some drivers needed to go through the DBS system again, so they did. Under half of all the London drivers affected were driving with Uber, but now all drivers driving with Uber, licensed by TfL, have been through this checking from the one approved provider. And the last is Greyball, and Uber has always stated that Greyball has never been used to evade regulators or enforcement in the UK, and it simply never would be, and it's agreeing a condition in Cambridge to that effect, and that is enforceable, as I've said, by the criminal law, and of course on pain of revocation and all the consequences which follow when you break your promises enshrined in licenses. So that's TfL. Can I then deal with Panther, a local service, and their objection is on page 119. And Panther refers on page 119 to exclusion zones. Now, as Mr. Jones has just described to you, Uber has also worked with the council officers on exclusion zones and has now blacked out an area surrounding the station so that drivers have to wait outside the excluded zone. My client understands the council is happy with the current arrangement. If it isn't, of course, then the conversation continues. Because the streets are yours to regulate, and they're not Uber's just to enjoy whatever it wants to do. Panther then refers towards the bottom of page 120, 3 paragraphs from the bottom, to safeguarding training. And we note that the City Council has such a requirement for new licence applicants in its November 17 policy. And we are happy to encourage Uber's Cambridge licensed drivers using Uber to take the course which you specify. I think it's there for new applicants, but my client is happy to retrospectively apply it to its existing drivers. Page 121, there's a point made about reporting, and I've already dealt with that in the context of TfL. To be clear, following serious complaints, Uber always reported to the licensing authority and suspended drivers' access to apps while the investigations continued. The question was whether it was down to Uber or the customer to report particular criminal allegations to the police. E.g., if the customer said, I don't want this reported, what does Uber then do about that? Well, as the written submissions show, Uber is working in an extensive partnership with the Metropolitan Police and has created a law enforcement portal to improve communications. In addition to that, the police have chaired a working group that devised standards and mechanisms for Uber to report and make information available to the police. Now there's material going on in those conversations which unfortunately is confidential because the Met Police want it that way. But if the council has got views on that sort of topic, then that's exactly the sort of thing that Uber is really happy to have a conversation about in this forum or outside. Uber just wants to do what is felt right to do in each local area. Now, there's then a point made about routes taken, and it said, well, drivers locally might not know the shortest routes and so forth. Now that view, with respect, is not apparently shared by 5 million customers a month in the UK, but Uber uses an advanced programme to calculate shortest routes and journey times, and is augmenting this by work whereby literally photographs are taken in individual cities, including Cambridge, to make sure that local things which don't just show up on a map are picked up and then can be put into the configured programme to ensure that customers never take a longer or more expensive journey than they need to. But if they do feel that the driver's taken too long or taken a tortuous, circuitous route and the customer has been charged more than they ought to have been, they can complain at the push of a button. It's very easy to do it with Uber, and if the complaint is justified, they will be refunded in minutes. And essentially what happens is that the clever Uber people put the route taken against what the expected route is, and if it's resulted in disadvantage to the customer, then that's rectified and refunded within minutes. So that's the way the Uber system works. There's then a point made on page 121 about the knowledge of the customer about the licence status of drivers. So do you know when you've travelled with a driver who they're licensed by? Again, this is something where Uber are content with the condition which is set out on page 117. I can tell you that this requires some reconfiguration within the app so that the customer is clearly told, both at time of booking and at the point of receipt, you have just taken a ride with a driver licensed in Cambridge, as the case may be. But that reconfiguration is going to be rolled out by early 2018. I'd like to say January 2018, but in case there's a slip or two, I can tell you it's early 2018. And it's in the process of being tested now. Moving on, there's an objection on page 123 from the Cambridge Taxi and Private Hire Association, who I'm just bound to point out start their letter with a threat of legal action. I'm sure the committee won't be influenced by that. I'm sure the committee will make the correct decision with the correct legal advice, whatever threats are made. You have a discretion, which I'm sure you'll exercise properly. The objectors don't have a right of appeal. They can only apply to judicially review you in the High Court, and the High Court would only interfere if you behave unlawfully in some way. And of course, given that you haven't made your decision, it seems curious to say that you're going to be appealed if it doesn't go a particular way. One would need to look at the decision before coming to that conclusion. So I pass over the threat. In the third paragraph, there's a reference to public safety, and I'm sure that concern is genuine. Every taxi driver is concerned with public safety. It's just that it's not noted there that there's no evidence that public safety has been compromised by Uber in the more than 200,000 journeys which have been taken by Cambridge residents and visitors since Uber first got its licence here. So the empirical evidence is that the public are safe using Uber in this city. There's then a reference to how Uber is structured and where it pays its tax and so forth, which of course isn't relevant to public safety in Cambridge. There's an issue raised about whether Uber would engage in predatory pricing, that is to say deliberately dropping its prices in order to hound out the competition. That's something which Uber just doesn't do. It is, however, true that Uber is a very large and quite young organisation, and the capital outlay in setting up something of that kind of scale is vast, and there are early years losses, as one would expect with any large investment of any new startup company. There's then points made on page 124 about TfL, which I have dealt with, but there is a specific allegation that there are 10,000 drivers on Uber driving around London without TfL's consent, and that is simply and categorically untrue. In fact, as it happens, less than 1/2 of the number of drivers who originally had their DBS done by checkers who TfL ceased to approve were in fact Uber drivers. But the current situation is that everyone driving round using the Uber app licensed by the TfL has been through the proper checking process with TfL's approved provider, who are called the GB Group. So that point is with respect, just misplaced. There's then a point made on page 125 about sexual offences. And this is a serious topic because, let me be clear, that one single sexual offence by a taxi driver, hackney carriage, private hire, anywhere, is one too many. And Uber is wholly committed to doing everything that it possibly can do to protect customers. All licensed drivers, as you know, whether driving under an Uber banner or whether driving with somebody else, go through the same regulatory vetting process, and all of them are DBS checked. And of course, nobody with any kind of history of sexual misconduct would be permitted to drive with Uber, or I'm sure would be permitted to drive by any responsible licensing authority. However, there are people in society who commit sexual offences. It can't always be anticipated. Looking at the stats on this, Uber have got 58% of all private hire licences in London, but just over half of the licensed private hire drivers charged with sexual offences in London drive with the Uber app. In other words, drivers using Uber are not statistically more likely, in fact they're statistically less likely, to commit a sexual assault than other licensed drivers. But there is one important distinction. If, heaven forfend, an Uber driver were to sexually assault somebody, there is a complete record of the driver, the passenger, and the journey, wherever it took place, the driver stops. All of that is recorded, and that is a strong aid to detection. And certainly, TfL is not suggesting that Uber is condoning sexual assault in any way, or is lax in whom it employs, or anything of that sort. And I can only tell you that Uber will work effectively with city authorities such as yours to root out the possibility of sexual assault. It's almost impossible to imagine something further distant from the kind of service which Uber wishes to operate. Now, the associations then refer to operational practices at page 125. There is a case which you may have read about proceeding through the courts as to whether drivers using the Uber app are workers, which is a statutory term, or whether they are self-employed. And I can only tell you that these are genuine and important legal issues, not just in the taxi trade, but in wider industry, as to whether these more casual transactional relationships, where the driver can work when they want, where they want, the hours they want, etc., whether they are self-employed people or whether they are workers. Now, the case law is not necessarily consistent, and Uber is entitled to and wants a ruling on it from the appeal court. That is how law works in a democracy. You could ask the court to adjudicate on something, and I would say with respect that in our country it doesn't make you unfit when you exercise a legal right granted to you. There is then a complaint about Uber's got a very small number of vehicles licensed in Cambridge. There's a complaint made about handling passengers with disabilities in Cambridge, What I can tell you is that with this very small number of vehicles, they are not wheelchair accessible. Of course, if your wheelchair folds, you can put it in the back, but they're not wheelchair accessible vehicles. But as the fleet grows in Cambridge, as it has in other cities, then Uber will seek to ensure that the fleet includes fully wheelchair accessible vehicles. There's then a topic on page 126 called surging, and this is what happens when the demand amongst customers for Uber vehicles outstrips the local ability to satisfy that demand. In other words, demand is bigger than the supply. And in those times, Uber will apply surging. In other words, through the app, the demand-supply balance is analysed several times a minute, and the customer, when they're booking a vehicle, will be told, well, there's a surge applicable to this, which is 1.5 or 1.7. Do you still want to proceed with this booking? It's up to the customer whether they do. They may then decide, well, no, I don't fancy 1.7, I'll use another provider. And then within a few minutes, when the surge is gone, the customer may find that the pricing then comes down. So that's Uber's way of smoothing out this demand-supply balance. But the important thing is the customer is wholly aware, both before the booking and after the booking, that they've been paying a surge price, so they can make a positive choice. Uber's service is still cheaper than other providers most of the time. What Uber does not do is to permit drivers to flick their app on and off so as to create this demand-supply imbalance. It's not proper behaviour and is rooted out by the app. So the whole idea about differential pricing in transport is well understood. You go off peak on a train, it's cheaper. If you're working in a black cab after such a clock, when the pubs come out, it may be more expensive, and so forth. This is Uber's way of sorting out demand-supply balance, and it doesn't seem to have affected its actual popularity in the market. There's then a heading on page 126 of local malpractices, which is essentially what happens if a vehicle driving with Uber crosses a border and is breaking the rule of the licensing authority that they're working with. And I can only tell you that we don't accept this allegation if a car which is licensed elsewhere is breaching the terms of its license, and this is drawn to Uber's attention. It will suspend the driver's access to the app immediately, and it will report the matter to the relevant licensing authority. There's a 24/7 support team on hand at the main office to respond to allegations of a serious nature immediately, including, as I say, suspending access to the app while investigations take place. So those are the objections which were made as part of the main bundle. And then there have been some further objections which were raised in a supplementary bundle. And I can just get that up. It's a bundle which restarts the pagination of page 1. And the first objection there is from objectors in Brighton and Hove. And they referred to a data breach in November 2016. Now this is extensively dealt with in the written submissions which we have served, but in brief, the circumstances of this breach were that illegal access was obtained to archived customer data. This included names and email addresses of customers, but not, I hasten to add, bank or credit card data or date of birth. If I can just read out the passage which Councillor Benstead referred to and which was redacted. Uber's new CEO, Dara Khosrowshahi, was informed that there'd been some type of data incident involving a payment, but he did not receive many details regarding the incident, including the full nature of the incident, whether data had actually been downloaded, the extent of any damage caused or mitigated, whether the incident did or did not need to be reported, the circumstances surrounding the payment, who was aware of the incident, or why the incident had not previously been reported. Because of these unanswered questions, Mr. Khosrowshahi directed that a thorough investigation be conducted into the circumstances surrounding the incident, including whether it should have been previously disclosed. Once the initial forensic investigation was completed and the relevant people at Uber Technologies Inc., UTI, believed they had sufficient facts, they moved quickly to notify Uber subsidiaries, regulators, the public, and the Dutch regulator of data protection, as well as take the appropriate personnel actions to ensure accountability. And as you know, the UK company, which had no idea about this until it was revealed, then wrote to you about the data breach on, I'll give you the date, it's page 131 of the original bundle, at page 131. Now, what we've said about the data breach in this document, and what I'm relating to you here, were not before the committee in York when it made its decision last week, and Uber wasn't invited to deal with the matter, but I'm really pleased that Uber's getting the opportunity here to set out the detail more fully. I must tell you that Uber has worked extremely strenuously to ensure that this breach could not be repeated. There's no evidence that the data has been misused, but regrettably, individuals who knew about this data breach in Uber in the USA did not report the breach to regulators, as clearly they ought to have done. And those responsible for that omission, I can tell you, are no longer with Uber. Now, I've explained to you there's a new broom. In 2017, when the new CEO learnt of this, he caused the matter to be reported to regulators, including the Information Commissioner's Office in this country. The ICO here has stated that on its own, this data breach has not threatened UK citizens. As I've said, Uber told you about this breach along with other UK regulators, other local licensing authorities when it learned of the matter. But on behalf of Uber Britannia Limited, I can give you the assurance that both here and internationally, the integrity of customer data is given the highest possible priority. Nothing could be more damaging to a company which works only through an app than for a customer to think, well, Uber don't really care about my own confidentiality. Uber is unfortunately not the first company to have suffered a data breach, but it devotes a very large amount of resources to protect the integrity of its customers' data, and under the guidance of its CEO and board, is working with regulators to ensure compliance with data protection laws and principles. But can I just ask Mr. Jones just to say a word or two more, do you want to, about data security at Uber?
Absolutely. I just wanted to say a few words, as Mr. Colvin said. Data security for a company like ours is critical and something we take really seriously. So I just wanted to just give a little bit of colour about what that means and what we do. And what we do. So first of all, our data centres. So this is where Uber stores customer data, so rider and driver data. These data centres are SOC2 compliant. So chatting to our technical folk and our security experts. SO2 stands for Service Organisation Control Reports. This is a third-party attestation report, a kind of certification that's used by lots of companies globally, and it sets out standards and guidelines that basically validates and confirms that we've taken the appropriate safeguards when storing and handling that data to protect it, particularly when you're sharing it, say for making a financial transaction. With regards to specific financial data, such as credit card data, this is protected according to the PCI DSS 3.2 standard, which is a very specific set of standards that really gives very detailed criteria on how you should manage and store that data. Again, to a recognised standard that a lot of companies use. In terms of how we approach and the measures we're taking around how employees and contractors access our systems. So whenever you log on, an employee, such as myself, logs on to an Uber system where data is stored, we have two-factor authentication. So what this means is I'll log onto the system on my computer and I'll get sent a separate SMS, email, or push notification to my phone where I have to type in that code and it validates it's my identity and I'm the individual that's claiming to be logging in on my computer. So that's something that all employees have to go through when they access our internal systems. We've also developed a number of quite sophisticated fraud rules. So these constantly check the behaviour of riders and drivers logging into their accounts to spot unusual activity that might be an indicator of fraud. And so we can take specific action in those cases if we see something suspicious or odd going on with how someone's using the app. Finally, in terms of processes and policies, also for individuals working for Uber, is we've got those policies that monitor and control who has access to sensitive PII, so personally identifiable information, to make sure that the individuals that access that have a legitimate business purpose. And we have very tight controls and policies around that, so that can only be the case in Uber.
Thank you, and obviously the data breach is an awful occurrence. There hasn't been a repeat of anything like that, as I take it, Mr. Jones, in the last year and a bit.
No, not that we've been alerted to.
Okay. And I think just the final point, councillors, if you can bear listening to me for another couple of minutes, that I need to deal with, is in the supplementary bundle at page 35, Alpha make a point regarding the acceptance of the booking. And this is very well-worn territory now, and it's of interest to lawyers. It doesn't affect the safety of passengers and is therefore tangential to operating licence issues. The question being who accepts the booking and who's the contract with. So for the record, Uber's terms and conditions, which are on the app and on the Uber website and therefore readily available to anyone who wants to see it, say that the passenger's contract for transportation is with the driver. However, this terms also make clear, Uber accepts the contract as agent for the driver. And then section 56 of the 1976 Act says that the contract shall be deemed to be made with the operator. So Uber is deemed to be the contracting party for regulatory purposes. And Uber, of course, accepts all of the regulatory responsibilities of being the holder of an operating licence wherever it operates, including here Cambridge, and these include clearly record keeping, lost property, and appropriate liaison with the local authority in response to issues arising. I'm taking that reasonably shortly. So members, in conclusion, it's right to say that there's been a well-organised industry campaign against Uber in a number of cities. But if one good thing has come of it, it has spurred Uber on to answer the criticisms and to try always to improve its practices. And I hope that in Cambridge you take the view that Uber has forged a good regulatory relationship, and insofar as it's fallen short, apologise and would obviously want to do everything possible to make amends. But the purpose ultimately of this system is to get passengers from A to B safely, and there's no evidence that that has failed in Cambridge in the 200,000 journeys since Uber started to operate here. It's content to accept further conditions on its license to allay extra concerns, and we've talked about 3 which have been raised thus far. And for those reasons, and thanks so much for listening to me, but in short, we'd respectfully ask you to renew this licence. Here we are, then. Questions?
Okay, thank you very much. I've just got one question on page 117.
Yes.
The potential new operator conditions. you see here if Uber Britannia Limited must report to the council allegations of complaints relating to certain serious behaviours.
Yes.
And then it gives you a list.
Yes.
I just wonder why it takes 24 hours for that driver not to be able to use that app.
I don't know the answer to that, but we didn't draft this condition. Can I ask Mr. Jones whether that we can do something a little quicker than that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can open to discussion around what is a good timeline. Obviously, we have a team that monitors the complaints coming through the app and on social media 24 hours a day. And as soon as they pop up, we act on them as quick as possible. But yeah, we're happy to.
I'm wondering whether a better wording for the committee would simply be the operator must restrict the driver's access to the app as soon as reasonably practicable. If that would work, or some other sort of wording.
Yeah,
You're right. I mean, if you've got a very serious allegation, it shouldn't take 24 hours, and there's no reason for it to.
And that's my concern.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, do you want to go first?
Thank you. I have a set of questions for you. The law, of course, is a bit of an ass when it comes to this. Our job is to ensure that, should we relicense you, that our residents here are safe. Now, of course, most of the drivers you employ aren't registered here. They're licensed elsewhere.
Yeah.
So when you say that our residents are safe,
Yeah.
it's based on the 4 drivers down to 2 now. It doesn't actually make much sense. As a public health doctor, of course, I'm interested in the population statistics
Yeah.
here, and I have no idea of that. Now, I know that in comparisons, nationally and in London, you come out well with this, and I know that the app does a pretty good job of making things safe for people. But it doesn't make sense to me that where we have a problem that is local,
Yeah.
with drivers from Wolverhampton and all over the place coming here, that we don't know about it through your license here.
Yeah.
Now, the only reason for wanting to know that is so that we can jump on the safety issues
Yeah.
with the police and so on rapidly.
Yeah.
So that's my first point. Do you want to answer that? Or do you want to put the...
I'm in your hands. Should I answer? It's an important point to raise. The first element of this is you're right, because of the way the legislation is framed, and Parliament made a deliberate decision about this anyway with the Deregulation Act to allow subcontracting across borders. It is perfectly legal for a driver to get a licence in place A and drive off to place B and use that licence. And you're not wrong to mention Wolverhampton, because that's one of the authorities that licenses a vast number of drivers, not just Uber drivers, who then go off and use their licences elsewhere. And they use technology to ensure that the cars remain up to scratch, and they send inspectors out to other authorities and so forth. And so it is inherent in the system, A, that drivers can go anywhere, but B, the efficacy of the system also depends on a network of relationships. Firstly, a good relationship between the licensing authority and the authority where drivers are driving, A. And secondly, in the case of Uber, a good relationship between the local licensing authority and someone like Uber. The benefit of somebody like Uber is you're able to say, now listen here, Fred, we had a Sandwell operator or Wolverhampton licensed driver, and they didn't have their rear lights on, or they didn't have the appropriate logo on their car, and how could we know who they are? So the benefit of dealing with a company like Uber is at least you're going to have your issues sorted out quickly. But you are right that the way the system works is you may well have, and are likely to have, drivers from outside the area driving in Cambridge. Now, this will happen whether or not you grant the license to Uber today. And I don't want to sound high-handed about that, but that is a commercial reality. The best intervention that a licensing authority can therefore make is to license locally. And if there is a license here, then there's more possibility of Uber being able to build up a very local taxi trade which works according to your standards. So I can't give you a perfect answer, but the problem which you identify is better addressed by licensing than not licensing.
I hear that. I'm still concerned, and it's not because of Uber.
Yes.
It's because of the mechanisms that are actually weakening our ability to detect things early and
Yeah.
jump on them for the safety of
Yeah.
our local residents.
And I would say about that, I mean, I sit on a committee which is trying to look at a national model convictions policy, so that all authorities would take the same approach to previous convictions. And the sooner we get to some national model standards for drivers and vehicles, which I really hope is going to be achieved in the next few years. So once we've finished dealing with Brexit, we'll have time for all sorts of things legislatively. But even if it's not legislative and it's voluntary through a network of councils, the sooner we can get to that, locally, regionally and nationally, the sooner your concern will be allayed. But at least for the time being, and I know it's not perfect, Councillor Moore, you're dealing with a company that's anxious to please and has got controls and tags on the drivers driving with it on a national basis.
That's my first issue. The second issue I have relates to the reporting.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know. I've enjoyed using Uber in London.
Yeah.
But I've never had to complain. Perhaps that's a good thing.
Yeah.
But I haven't had that many journeys. The process by which that complaint, what I'm trying to get at here is that these complaints, all complaints, not just the ones that lead to convictions and so on, they form a pattern.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't want to wait till 5 rapes have happened, but that's going to happen quickly. But if you've got a complaint against a driver, it's often the beginning of a problem that driver has.
Yeah.
So it's important to know all of those, even if you're dismissing them.
Absolutely.
That's probably that's the second one. That's unusual.
Yeah.
So it's that
Yes.
detection.
Picking up the pattern.
It's that pattern which helps the local licensor, which might be Wolverhampton, to detect that. So that's my sound. I don't know how that happens with you. I would much.
Can I ask Mr. Jones, because I know that he feels quite strongly on this topic.
Yeah.
So can I ask him to answer that?
Absolutely, Councillor. It's a very completely valid point and something we take seriously. And so there are actually 2 ways that we kind of take in complaints or reports of issues with drivers. So the first is through the app with a passenger, and when if you have an issue or you rate below 4 stars at the end of the trip, you have to select what the reason is. Was it route taken, professionalism, quality of the car, etc., and give us a bit of feedback. So even if it's a low-level incident on the surface, as you'll see from the complaint report in the bundle, where there's all sorts of stuff that people write in about, that's logged on the driver's profile. And so we can see over time that if they're rude, actually, are they always rude? Is it actually a bit of an issue with their customer service ability? And so, as well as obviously reporting that to Cambridge, we also look internally to determine whether that driver should be using the Uber app. The second source of complaints is actually from the licensing and enforcement teams. So, for example, if Mr. Catchpole alerts us to any driver, driving around maybe without the livery affixed correctly, that also, as well as taking the action on that incident and reporting to their local licensing authority, that also goes onto their record. So we can see and spot a pattern if this driver is systematically refusing to meet their conditions, and we can take the appropriate action as well. So absolutely, it's something we do. We're happy for the Cambridge drivers as well, to share those complaints, but also take the action ourselves as a responsible authority.
Perhaps linking the councillor's two questions. If a customer complains about a driver, gives them 3 stars, says they were rude, or whatever it is, that it doesn't matter where they're licensed. It still comes to you, and you still look at their conduct and to see whether there's anything there which needs correcting, or ultimately they may be barred from using the app.
Yeah, that's correct. That's how the system works.
Okay. My issue there comes back to the nonsense of the law.
Yeah.
But we're relying on Wolverhampton. I'm taking Wolverhampton or Wolverhampton's name in vain here. But it's the license or each of the times.
You are to an extent. You're also relying on Uber's credibility as a company to handle issues which are drawn to its attention.
I agree, which is why I'm saying that your responsibilities are greater, really, as a consequence of this.
Yes, you're right. You're right. I mean, there's responsibilities as a licensee, which are legal responsibilities owed to the licensing authority, and then there are wider responsibilities as a company to make sure that it's running a safe, reliable service wherever the local licensing happens to take place. Now, I'm sure on behalf of Mr. Jones, I mean, both of those are cheerfully accepted by Uber because the brand depends on it.
I agree. Now, the next one. You get treated rudely, you get an inappropriate grab or something, and you've left the taxi a bit shocked. How do you know who to complain to? It's not clear to customers, in any case, who to complain to. And I would like it to be very clear. So who do you complain to? Who's the licensing authority of the driver?
Yeah.
What's their phone number?
Right.
That should be put into the receipt that they get.
Yes.
So that there's no issue. They can go home and they can think about it and think, no, that was awful.
That shouldn't have happened.
Yeah, but now I can't remember I've got to tell them.
Okay, so that's for Mr. Jones to deal with.
I think it's a really good point and linked to one of the proposed conditions around giving that extra information is absolutely that's something that we're willing to do. So they know that they can complain to Uber, but they also know if there's the other authority that they want to complain to, then they've got that information as well. So that's an update to the app that more than happy to provide to address that concern.
And that wouldn't obviously be to just Cambridge residents, because they need to know to whom to complain. The next issue that I have, I've forgotten what it is now. Well, the simplicity to complain I've dealt with. No, I'll hand over to you. I'll come back to the. Oh, why not? The vulnerable residents that we have, they get shipped around, often by someone else putting them on. I put Granny on, I put my mentally disabled child in the taxi to go and see Granny, and so on. They're very vulnerable. They're vulnerable on all sorts of fronts, and I want to ensure that the maximum protection is given to them. Obviously, through the driver being good, the vehicle being good. I would like to see the driver having a decent medical, because if they're going to get a heart attack and crash at the wheel, you really want to detect that early, and it appears that you're doing that now better. Then we come down to the knowledge that is gathered in this process that the driver can use, and whether the leaks that have been the data breaches and the information that the driver has gleaned, how much, so I'm conflating two sources of information here, but the point is the same. How do we ensure that any of those breaches of the data both on your systems and outside, are picked up as soon as we possibly can. And this comes back to getting back to the police. So this comes back to local geography, which is part of the same issue earlier on that I talked about.
Yes. Okay. Do you want to talk about the data breach part?
Yeah.
You talk about
Yeah.
data breach.
So with regards to the specific data breach, the data that was accessed there was mobile number, email address, no location data was accessed on that. And whilst that's still not good and not acceptable, the one small kind of mercy was it wasn't passwords or any financial information. So there wasn't within that data, there wasn't kind of stored or access any driver kind of intelligence that you noticed. One thing just to mention on the locality is one thing that we are able to do is through the GPS data and the information we do gather is know exactly where a trip happened that there was a complaint about, or where that driver lives because of their postcode, etc. So when reporting and working with the police forces nationally, of which there's loads, we're able to make sure that the right local authorities know, because we capture with those complaints the specific piece. Does that answer your kind of concern?
Have you any evidence of the minimal data, but on 57 million people, have been abused to the detriment of those individuals?
There's no evidence to suggest that, and the ICO also commented that based on the data that was accessed, that whilst obviously not great for the users, didn't pose any risks of financial fraud or anything coming off the back of that.
Thank you. So I come back now to the next local issue, is about working with our local police force, and whether they understand how to contact you, how to gain access to that data, or the data that they might need for criminal things. Again, I don't understand.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a kind of dedicated email address for all the police officers to contact us. In fact, when I came to a committee meeting here, I met a representative of the police force. Local police force provided those details to him. Also provided them to the local licensing team, because I understand personnel might change in the local police units, so they can pass on that detail as well. But as in Cambridge, as with anywhere in the UK, if they would like us to, our law enforcement team to come and meet with them to discuss local issues, more than happy to do that. And that's something that we've done in lots of places. And that law enforcement response team is staffed in part by people who used to be policemen, so they understand the processes and the terminology and things that are really important to the police. So we're happy to do that as well.
Can I just mention one other point about data at a local level? So if you book an Uber, as you probably know, you find out the name of the driver and all that sort of stuff. All the driver knows about you is your name. So no other detail about you, address, date of birth, services, anything, is conveyed to the driver. So as far as the driver is concerned, they pick up a human being, convey that human being to the place appointed by that human being. And that means, well, I don't particularly want to give evidence, but as you imagine, like any human being, I've got elderly people in my life and young people in my life. The beauty of it is that you could entrust an older person or a younger person to an Uber driver, and if you're concerned about them, you can then just watch the progress of their journey on the app. The driver just never learns any data about you at all. So far as local partnerships are concerned, this very much depends on the activity of the local police force. We know from Rotherham that if you get it wrong, that terrible things can happen, but that's why you need these strong networks to build up, and that's why Uber here in Cambridge has got real people in a real office and wants to have these relationships, so there are issues Uber is aware of.
Thank you. My last point I don't think is admissible here, and that is that the alternatives, the competitors,
Yeah.
can be undercut if you export your profits
Mm-hmm.
to a low tax regime.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think I can mention that at all here, but that's fine. Right, that's it, I've said.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, that's a very full response to my
Thank you.
concerns.
I've just got one more question before I pass on to Councillor Benstead. You said in the report that you've got 2 drivers licensed here.
I believe that's the latest count, yes.
Yep.
Councillor.
And you've said that you'll be asking them to do our safeguarding training.
Absolutely, if that's something that would be valuable, because I think they've already been licensed rather than going through the process again. So I'm happy to make those arrangements. It seems like a good thing to do, so that happy to do that.
And you'd be willing to carry on with any new drivers you get would do this training through the City Council, because it's a very important bit of training.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, potentially we could come to an arrangement where if we knew there was a set date each week or month, we could, when drivers sign up and use the app, we could give them that information and check in to see if they've done that training, or pass their details to the licensing team to book them into that training. That's actually something we could explore, because like you say, it's really important.
And when somebody gets into your cabs, can we see the driver's licence number cleared?
So I think that was one of the suggestions, the new conditions, which more than happy to take on. That change, as Mr. Colvin said, it requires quite a bit of a significant change to the app. So we're happy to make that change and build the new software. It will probably be hopefully earlier rather than later in early 2018 that will be ready. But we could say when you book it and you get the booking confirmation, the name of the licensing authority, and then as Councillor Moore pointed out, when you get the electronic receipt afterwards with all the route and driver information, we could put something in there that says this driver was licensed by Cambridge City Council, we've got an issue, contact.
Yeah.
Some words or detail that satisfies your concerns there.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll pass you on now to Councillor Benson. It could be a long one.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I've got